Al Warren Sprouse here on the Bible Forum. It is Sunday night, January 21st, 2017, and this is the Bible Forum. We're going to be looking at some of the issues that have faced us this week around the world. I have some other articles and things that I want to share with you. We've got a new feature this week, the Counselor's Corner. We're going to look at some biblical principles relative to counseling. We've got our Sunday sermon again that will come in toward the end of the show. But right now I want to just take a peek at what has rushed by us in the last 7 days. We have all of this hoopla mess going on here in Washington, D.C. Relative to our budget and all of the pieces, the puzzle of things that are coming together. It seems to be held up. They didn't pass the bill. Last night at midnight was the deadline, and so here we are almost 24 hours later. And it seems that the big holdup was this thing called DACA. And of course, DACA is all about family members of people who came here as immigrants and so forth and so on. Do you know what DACA is doing or how this is working? DACA came into being as an executive order. It is not the law of the land. President Obama signed this document because the courts had already determined that a similar program was unconstitutional. It's a political maneuver to get around the law so that we can get and keep as many immigrants as possible, regardless of what the law might say. But we are a country governed by law. President Trump was sworn in as president a year ago, and he promptly rescinded that order. Now the Democrats are holding up the budget, creating all the perceived hardships on public employees that they claim that this will inflict, and making it look like the Republicans are the ones doing it. The truth? They could have passed a similar law under Obama 6 years ago when the Democrats controlled both houses. They didn't do it. Why not? Well, because somebody would take them to court, and it would go all the way to the Supreme Court, and they'd rule they can't do it. But for now, the tactic is working, or at least it seems that way. A wise immigration policy has always been one that considers the host's needs first. We, the United States of America, we are the host. We invite people to come, or we open the door and let people to come. It's always been about us. Now, I imagine President Trump and the Republicans will go back to the drawing board. They will craft a budget that every Republican can embrace, and we'll move on from here. We will stop talking to these Democrat spoilers if we're wise. We will stop allowing them to play to the media and to their constituents. No rational person would open their home to strangers. Strangers who would simply sit around, eat their food, and expect them to take care of the strangers. The strangers would expect the homeowner to take care of them for the rest of their lives. I say we should put all this aside, and whoever has the power should govern. This past week, Planned Parenthood released their 2017 report, the annual report. And what it said was that they killed 321,384 innocent babies. Killed them before they were old enough to fight back. And that's not counting the women who died as a result of these abortions. And who's paying for these mass murders? You are. I am. We do that through our taxes. Perhaps not for very much longer. A growing number of states are working to stop Planned Parenthood financing. We need to keep in mind that Washington, D.C. does not operate like the real world. Do you remember several months back, FBI Director James Comey? He eventually got fired. Do you remember what he did? Under his leadership, the FBI was probably acting as the most corrupt it has ever been, even with all the nonsense of the first director of what is now the FBI, Herbert Hoover. Before Herbert Hoover, this agency was called the Bureau of Investigation. And Herbert Hoover was a manipulator, and a blackmailer. He kept tabs on all sorts of people and used it. But even Herbert Hoover did not collude with our sworn enemies to subvert a presidential election. Mr. Comey's FBI did just that. It's becoming clear now. Well, today we learned, or this week anyway, that Mr. Comey has just been hired by the College of William and Mary to teach a course on ethical leadership at the school's Washington, D.C. Center. Comey's a 1982 graduate of the college, and the school calls him, quote, among William and Mary's most distinguished alumni. Comey commented saying, ethical leaders lead by seeing above the short term, above the urgent or the partisan, and with a higher loyalty to lasting values, and most importantly, the truth. Building and maintaining, he says, that kind of leadership in both the private sector and government is the challenge of our time. And who better to know the differences? We in this country have already defined deviancy down, as Daniel Patrick Moynihan said in 1993. We have done this in society and in the public arena by tolerating more and more of what used to be called immorality. Now, writing in the medical journal entitled Lancet, Dr. Susan Sawyer and other researchers opine that biological information and social trends suggest a need for adolescence to continue into an individual's mid-20s. That's right. No longer 18. Now, no longer 21. But the mid-20s. She writes, quote, arguably, the transition period from childhood to adulthood occupies a greater portion of the life course than ever before in a time when unprecedented social forces, including marketing and digital media, are affecting health and well-being across these years. An expanded and more inclusive definition of adolescence is essential for developmentally appropriate framing of laws, social policies, and service systems. Rather than age 10 to 19 years, she is suggesting a definition of 10 to 24 years more closely corresponds to adolescent growth and popular understanding of this life phase, and would facilitate extended investments across a broader range of settings. Which means more government money to education in order to train and otherwise support these underachievers. And just who is facilitating this decline? Why are these young people not growing up? Well, it's because of parents, so-called. 24? Why not 34? More and more young adults are living at home well into their 40s. Why stop at 24 years of age? On Tuesday morning this past week, President Donald Trump publicly proclaimed January 16 as the National Day of Religious Freedom. He called on Americans to celebrate the day so as to, quote, remind us of our shared heritage of religious liberty, end of quote. The president's announcement addressed both religious freedom internationally and within the United States. The only question is, how will it work? Well, from the president's point of view, each year he will declare January 16 as Religious Freedom Day and commemorate the anniversary of the passage of the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom in 1786, written by former President Thomas Jefferson. Apple Incorporated is almost running the world. But Apple is now telling us that they anticipate a $38 billion tax bill for repatriated cash as a result of the new tax bill. This implies that Apple will bring back virtually all of its $250 billion in overseas cash. Apple said it would spend over $30 billion in capital expenditures over the next 5 years. About $10 billion in capital expenditures will be investments in U.S. data centers. Apple added it will spend $5 billion as part of an innovation fund, up from $1 billion previously announced on CNBC's Mad Money. It's called tax reform, something previous Congresses thought either impossible or destructive. House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi calls it the apocalypse. We have been treated to weekly reports of major businesses giving their employees raises and bonuses on the strength of this new tax bill. Before Apple announced its workforce investment, Fiat Chrysler made a huge investment in one of its plants and served up new bonuses. A major restaurant company made a $20 million investment in its workforce. This makes over 100 companies that have announced salary increases or other benefits since Republicans passed the tax bill. Who knew? Economists and people who are older than 30 years of age. It was an article from the Independent Journal Review. It pointed out that British clinical psychologist and professor Jordan B. Peterson believes his, quote, right to freedom of speech trumps a trans person's right not to be offended. That's kind of a convoluted statement because of the way it's designed. But he is suggesting that people do not have to indulge the trans people by going along with their artificial designations of gender. All this came out in an interview with British Channel 4's anchor Cathy Newman. It's a YouTube, a video you can watch. It's funny. Peterson has taken a stance against political correctness and the use of gender-neutral pronouns. And he argues that in order to be able to think, you have to risk being offensive. He says, I mean, look, the conversation we're having right now with this anchor, you're certainly willing to risk offending me in the pursuit of truth. Why should you have the right to do that and not I? At first, Newman deflected Peterson's point, clearly uncertain how to combat his argument. So the psychologist just pressed on, saying, well, you get my point. You're doing what you should do, which is digging a bit to see what's going on. But you are exercising your freedom of speech to certainly risk offending me. And I think more power to you. The point was that transgenders and others who insist people refer to them in the way they want are being dictatorial in a social sense. As the interviewer became more upset and even more flustered, not being able to organize her thoughts quickly enough, Dr. Peterson merely responded by pointing to the obvious. He said Chinese dictator Mao Zedong and all totalitarian dictators started with the assumption that they were right and that they were more normal than anyone else. Their subsequent efforts were to make sure everyone else bowed to their superior moral or social standard. And in this situation, it's just the same. This woman's response to all of that? A series of it was a beautiful thing. We learned this week that the Arabs are getting much more technical. We're talking about the Middle East. In the early morning hours of January 6, 2018, a Russian airbase in Syria came under attack by a massive application of unmanned aerial vehicles, according to the Russian Ministry of Defense. They're called drones. According to reports, 13 small drones descended on Russian forces, but none of them did any significant damage. The captured aircraft, according to the Russians, seemed crudely made. They had a wooden undercarriage and plastic sheeting. They were powered by small liquid fuel engines. The drones carried several locally made bombs fitted with 3D printed plastic fins under their wings. According to the Russian news service, 6 of the drones were owned by an electronic warfare specialist and were diverted from the attack. Of the 6, 3 were successfully collected for examination, but the remainder detonated after landing. The Russians also went on to say the other 7 were blown up mid-air by their anti-aircraft missile system. Do you know anything about bitcoins? Bitcoins are the more popular form of what is being called digital currency. And this digital currency is being used today. Are they viable? Is this a viable form of currency? Is it sustainable? How do they play into our future? And what in the world are they? We're going to look at this idea of bitcoins a little bit later in the program. I, for one, have no real idea how they work. But I know people who are busily collecting them. I know one man who has a series of about 8 or 10 computer hard drives that do nothing but collect these things. Look around, get the bids, I guess, or look at the values or whatever, and then collect them. We are moving ever closer to an electronic age. It's a little scarier than you think. Stay tuned. We've got a lot more coming up in the show. In our next episode, I want to ask you the simple question: what did you learn in church? Not today. Growing up. Assuming you grew up in church, what'd you learn? Here's one person's revelation. We'll look at it next. Stay tuned.